Marvelous Medicine Number 3. Here it is, cried Mr. Killy Cranky, rushing into the kitchen. 1 carton of flea powders for dogs and 1 tin of brown shoe polish. George poured the flea powder into the giant saucepan. Then he scooped the shoe polish out of its tin and added that as well. Stir it up, George, shouted Mr. Cranky. Give it another boil. We've got it this time. I bet we've got it. After Marvelous Medicine Number 3 had been boiled and stirred, George took a couple of it out of the yard and tried it on another chicken. Mr. Cranky ran after him, flapping his arms and hopping with excitement. Come and watch this one, he called out to Mrs. Cranky. Come and watch us turn an ordinary chicken into a lovely great big one that lays eggs as large as footballs. I hope you do better than last time, said Mrs. Cranky, following them out. Come on, chicken, said George, holding out a spoonful of medicine number 3. Good chicken. Chick, 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 chick. Have some of this lovely medicine. A magnificent black cockerel with a scarlet comb came stepping over. The cockerel looked at the spoon and went pick. Cock-a-doodle-doo, squeaked the cockerels, shooting up into the air and coming down again. Watch him now, cried Mr. Cranky. Watch him grow. Any moment he's going to start bigger and bigger. Mr. Cranky, Killy Cranky, Mrs. Cranky, and little George stood in the yard, staring at the black cockerel. The cockerel stood quite still. It looked as though it had the headache. What's happening to its neck? Mrs. Cranky said. It's getting longer, George says. I'll say it's getting longer, Mrs. Cranky said. Mr. Cranky for once said nothing. Last time it was the leg, Mrs. Cranky said. Now it's a neck. Who wants a chicken with a long neck? You can't eat a chicken's neck. It was an extraordinary sight. The cockerel's body hadn't grown at all, but the neck was now about 6 feet tall, 6 feet long. All right, George, Mr. Cranky said. What else have you forgotten? I don't know, said George. George says. Oh, yes, you do, Mr. Cranky said. Come along, boy. Think. There's probably just one vital thing's missing, and you've got to remember it. I put in some engine oil from the garage, George said. Do you have that on your list? Eureka! Cried Mr. Cranky. That's the answer. How much did you put in? Half a pint, George says. Mr. Cranky ran to the garage and found another pint of oil and some antifreeze. George called after him. I splashed a bit of antifreeze. Marvelous Medicine Number 4. Back in the kitchen once again, George with Mr. Cranky watching him anxiously. They put half a pint of engine oil and some antifreeze into the giant saucepan. Boiled it up again, cried Mr. Cranky. Boiled it and stirred it. George boiled it and stirred it. You'll never get it right, said Mrs. Cranky. Don't forget you don't just have to have the same things, but you've got to have exactly the same amount of these things. And how can you possibly do that? You keep out of this, cried Mr. Cranky. We're doing fine. We got it this time. You see if we hadn't. This was George's Marvelous Medicine Number 4, and when it had boiled for a couple of minutes, George once again carried a couple of it out into the yard. Mr. Cranky ran after him. Mrs. Cranky followed more slowly. "You're going to have some mighty queer chickens around here if you go on like this," she says. "Dish it out, George," cried Mr. Cranky. "Give a spoonful of that one over there." He pointed to the brown hen. George knelt down and held out a spoon with a new medicine on it. "Chick, chick," he said. "Try some of this." The brown hen walked over and looked at the spoon. Then it went pig. "Ouchie!" it said. Then the funny whistling noise came out of its beak. Watch it grow!" cried Mr. Cranky. "Don't be too sure," said Mrs. Cranky. "Why is it whistling like that?" "Keep quiet, woman," cried Mr. Cranky. "Give it a chance." They stood there staring at the brown hen. "It's getting smaller," George said. Look at it, Dad. It's drinking." And indeed it was. In less than a minute, the hen had shrunk so much it was no bigger than a new hatched chick. It looked ridiculous. "Goodbye, Grandma." "There's still something you left out," Mr. Cranky said. "I can't think what could it be," George says. "Give it up," Mrs. Cranky says. Pack it in. You'll never get it right." Mr. Cranky looked very foreign. George looked pretty fed up too. He was still kneeling on the ground with a spoon in one hand and the cup full of medicine in the other. The ridiculous tiny brown hen was walking slowly away. At that point, Grandma came staring into the yard. From her enormous height, she glared down at the three people below her, and she shouted, "What's going on around here? Why hasn't anyone brought me my morning cup of tea? It's bad enough having to sleep in the yard with the rats and mice, but I'll be blow if I'm going to starve as well. No tea, no eggs and bacon, no buttered toast." "I'm sorry, Mother," Mrs. Cranky says. We've been terribly busy. I'll get you something right away." "Let George get it, the lazy little brats," Grandma shouted. Just then the old woman spotted the cup in George's hand. She bent down and peered into it. She saw that it was full of brown liquid. It looked very much like tea. "Ho, ho," she cried. "Ha, ha! So that's your little great game, is it? You look after yourself all right, don't you? You make quite sure you've got a nice cup of morning tea. But you didn't think to bring once to your poor old Grandma. I always knew you were a selfish pig." "No, Grandma," George says. "This isn't—" "Don't lie to me, boy," the enormous old hag shouted. "Pass it up here this minute." "No," cried Mrs. Cranky. "No, Mother, no. No, Mother, don't. That's not for you." "No, you're against me too," shouted Grandma. "My own daughter trying to stop me having my breakfast. Trying to serve me out." Mr. Cranky looked up at the horrid old woman and smiled sweetly. "Of course it's for you, Grandma," he said. "You'll take it and drink a while it's nice and hot." "Don't think I won't," Grandma said, bending down from her great height and reaching out the huge horny hands of the cup. "Hand it over, George." No, Grandma." No, Grandma," George shouted, pulling a cup away. "You mustn't. You're not to have it." "Give it to me, boy," yelled Grandma. "Don't," cried Mrs. Cranky. "That's George Marvellous." "Everything's George around here," shouted Grandma. "George this, George that. I'm fed up with it." She snatched the cup out of little George's hands and carried it high up out of reach. "Drink it up, Grandma," Mr. Cranky said, grinning heartily. "Lovely tea." "No," the other two cried. "No, no!" But it was too late. The ancient beanhole had already put the cup to her lips. In one gulp, she swallowed everything that was in it. "Mother," wailed Mrs. Cranky, "you've just drank 50 doses of George's marvelous medicine number 4, and look what one tiny spoonful did to that old brown hen." But Grandma didn't even listen to her. Great clouds of steam were already pouring out of her mouth, and she was beginning to whistle. "This is going to be interesting," Mr. Cranky said, still grinning. "Now you've done it," cried Mrs. Cranky, glaring at her husband. "You cooked the old girl's goose." "I didn't do anything," Mr. Cranky said. "Oh, yes, you did. You told her to drink it." A tremendous hissing sound was coming from above her head. Steam was shooting out of Grandma's mouth and nose and ears, and whistling as it came. "She feels better after she's let off a bit of steam," Mr. Cranky said. "She's going to blow up," Mrs. Cranky yelled. "Her boiler going to burst." "Stand clear," Mrs. Cranky said. George was quite alarmed. He stood up and ran back a few paces. A jet of white steam kept squirting out of the skinny old hags, and the whistling was so high it thrilled it hard the ears. "Call the fire brigade," cried Mrs. Cranky. "Call the police, men of hosepipes." "Too late," said Mr. Cranky, looked pleased. "Grandma!" shrieked Mrs. Cranky. "Mother! Run to the drinking trough and put your heads under the water." But even as she spoke, the whistling suddenly stopped and the steam disappeared. That was when Grandma began to get smaller. She had started up with her head as high as the roof of the house, but now she was coming down fast. "Watch this, George!" Mr. Cranky shouted, hopping around the yard and flapping his arms. "Watch what happens when somebody had 50 spoonfuls instead of 1. Very soon, Grandma was back to normal height. "Stop!" cried Mrs. Cranky. "That's just right." But she didn't stop. Smaller and smaller she got. Down and down she went. In another half-minute, she was no longer than a bottle of lemonade. "How do you feel, Mother?" asked Mrs. Cranky anxiously. Grandma's tiny face still bore the same foul and furious expression as always had. Her eyes, no bigger than tiny little keyholes, were blazing with anger. "How do I feel?" she yelled. "How do you think I feel? How would you feel if you'd been a glorious giant a minute ago, and suddenly you're a miserable maggot?" "She's still going," shouted Mr. Cranky gleefully. "She's still getting smaller." And by golly, she was. When she was no bigger than a cigarette, Mrs. Cranky made a grab for her. She held her in her hands and shouted, "How do I stop her from getting smaller still?" "You can't," said Mr. Cranky. "She had 50 times the right amount." "I must stop her," Mrs. Cranky yelled. "I can hardly see her as it is." "Catch hold of each end and pull," Mrs. Cranky said. By then, Grandma was the size of a matchstick and still drinking fast. A moment later, she was no bigger than a pin. then a pumpkin seed, then... "Where is she?" cried Mrs. Cranky. "I've lost her." "Hooray!" said Mr. Cranky. "She's gone! She's disappeared completely!" cried Mrs. Cranky. That's what happened if you're grumpy and bad-tempered," said Mr. Cranky. "Great medicine of you, George." George didn't know what to think. For a few minutes, Mrs. Cranky kept wandering round with a puzzled look on her face, saying, "Mother, where are you? Where have you gone?" "Where have you got to? How can I find you?" But she calmed down quite quickly, and by lunchtime she was saying, "Ah, well, I suppose it's all for the best, really. She was a bit of nuisance around the house, wasn't she?" "Yes," Mr. Cranky said. She most certainly was." George didn't say a word. He felt quite trembly. He knew something tremendous had taken place that morning. For a few brief moments she had touched with the very tip of his finger and edge of the magic world.